and welcome to this week's episode, where for only the second time, host has turned guest. My name's Dave Woolmer, and I'm privileged to have been asked to host an episode of this award-winning podcast, so no pressure there then. I was going to describe this week's episode as a whistle-stop tour of show gardens, but it will hopefully be more of a thoughtful stroll. I suppose before we delve into more of the nitty-gritty about show gardens, we should first start with what a show garden actually is. And leading on from that, why we actually have show gardens.
A show garden, what is it? That is a very good question, Dave. And I don't know, is the short answer. I have no idea what a show garden is. And I've had a look on the RHS website and I can't see any indication as to what it is either, because they don't define a garden. So a show garden, if you're going by the RHS criteria, is presumably completely open, and that's why we get so many different versions of them. But I suppose in the traditional sense, what everybody would understand as a show garden is it is a garden that's just designed, put together and put out there for the public to visit. And obviously the most famous examples are the Chelsea Flower Show. You've got the Hampton Court. I don't know what they call it now, but I don't think they call it the Flower Show. They call it the Garden Festival or something. But yeah, the RHS show gardens are obviously the most well known here in the UK. But yeah, what is a show garden? What is a garden even? Very open to interpretation, I would say. But yes, in a nutshell, that's it.
You've mentioned the RHS. Obviously, in the UK, the majority of the major flower shows and garden festivals are organised by the RHS. But could you perhaps explain a bit more about what the role of the RHS is in the flower shows and in the show gardens?
Yeah, so I think it's ever changing, and it varies depending on what show you're talking about. So obviously you've got Chatsworth, Chelsea, as I said, Hampton Court, various other Tatton. So the RHS, as far as I can understand it from their website and from their things like their annual report on the Charity Commission, they are running the shows hoping to showcase the best of British horticulture. So that would be nurseries who grow plants, experts in their field, national collection holders. Obviously you've got the show gardens there. And as far as I can see, they're trying to promote the career of horticulture, the discipline of horticulture. They're trying to make a greener Britain. And they're also trying to showcase the art of gardening. So that's, I guess, where the design comes in. Yeah, and then I think they also use the shows as a vehicle to drive membership, from what I can see. And they host the shows. They will commission the designs. I don't know, well, they don't commission them as such. They kind of approve them. You would submit your design to the RHS for a show garden, and then they would kind of yay or nay it. And then you obviously go through them to submit the paperwork for things like health and safety. They get all the plans of how you're going to build it, what you're going to put in it. And then they provide you with the site, you rock up with all your stuff, and then at the end of the process you've built a garden and they judge it. So yeah, again, in a nutshell, that's kind of the RHS's role in show gardens.
So it's quite a lofty aspirations in terms of all of the different goals that they have for the shows and for the show gardens. And I suppose this is the $1 million question that all designers probably want to know, but what makes a good show garden design, and how does that differ, or does it differ indeed from a home garden design?
Well, I did a bit of research. This came up on an Instagram account called Decolonize the Garden. And it was really interesting because when I've just come back from the Chelsea Flower Show. So this is why this is a kind of topic that's foremost in my mind at the moment. Because it really made me think about what is the purpose of the show? Is this sustainable? Should we be doing this kind of thing in this day and age? Should we be building these gardens in all their extravagance? Should we be encouraging people to visit this site? All the kind of attendant catering and waste that's generated as a result of the show, or the road traffic, all the rest of it. But yeah, this account said that it linked to the judging criteria for an RHS show garden, and it said the people who exhibit there will get judged on things such as the quality of their plants. But then this account was saying who sets this quality. Who says that this is what a plant should look like? Who says that this is a good quality garden? I guess like all things judging, you have to have criteria. Otherwise it's too broad and nobody, if you had judges who just went along and said, I like that garden, it would be a completely subjective assessment and therefore maybe not as useful as one that is objective, and it says that it's good because of these reasons. So the RHS criteria for judging the show gardens is actually fivefold. So the first one is ambition, and that's how original is the design. Is there theatre, flair, atmosphere, and impact? And then the second one is overall impression. So does the garden work as a whole, and how fine is the finish and attention to detail? The next one is design, and does the garden work for its supposed purpose? The fourth one is construction. How good is the quality of the build? And the fifth one is the planting. So in that it says plants are judged basically on colour, impact, composition and health, but also would these plants live and survive together? So, how much would your garden work in reality? So, yes, there are things that are just purely, I suppose, theatre. The show gardens are theatre, but also they are supposed to look like real gardens. We know that they don't, because if you had a garden that was like a Chelsea show garden, it would only probably look peak in May, which is fine if that's what you want, but it would be unrealistic that you would just focus on that one season. In some ways, the gardens are useful as potential inspiration for your home garden. In other ways, they're actually a bit false, because maybe amateur gardeners will go along and think, oh, perfect, I can have a garden that looks like that, and in actuality they can't. They just couldn't achieve that look.
It's interesting to know that the RHS have obviously a fairly set objective criterion that they judge show gardens by, because to those of us that aren't in the design world, it can sometimes seem like the medals that are given for certain show gardens are almost difficult to understand. But then that leads me on to another question that, to an extent, I think that show gardens, particularly some of the categories at the likes of Chelsea Flower Show, some of the show gardens are similar to fine art, in that there seems to be a skill to actually read them and understand them. And I've often watched coverage of Chelsea Flower Show and other flower shows and wondered, with some of the gardens, if I'm actually missing the point that the gardens are trying to convey. I can sort of look at it and think, that's a very pretty garden, but I wondered if there's any particular skill to actually understanding a show garden.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And that's another thing that struck me when I was walking around the flower show this year. I thought, a lot of these gardens, they're working really hard. They have to grab the people, the visitors, visually to get their attention. And some of them will have a message that is just not hitting. A lot of people are at the show walking around going, this is a really pretty garden. Oh, that's a nice garden. I like those lupins. They're not going, actually, what's the message behind this garden? They're just not getting it at all. It's really tricky. There's no answers here. I can't think of a right way to host these shows. It might be that we need more conceptual gardens that aren't immediately readable, so that people actually do. I've done a concept garden at Hampton Court, and people, because it was so bizarre, and somebody said it was like being in a rave tent, people did come and ask me questions about it and said, well, what are you, what is this? What are you doing here? And then you get the opportunity to explain. So if it maybe challenges people and it's not immediately obvious, then you might get people asking questions, and people were actually pleasantly curious about it, which was nice, because then you got to talk about the charity that was kind of, that I was promoting through the garden. A lot of people, though, they'll just walk round, they want a glass of Pimm's, they want to look at the Bergen and Ball stand, and they'll walk past a garden that's conceptual and they'll go, oh, that looks a bit crap, doesn't it? What's that? Oh, that looks like somebody's, bit of waste ground. So it doesn't always work. Maybe we need fewer gardens. A lot of the gardens have got the things that you can scan so that you can go straight to a website which will tell you more about the garden. They've got people handing out leaflets. It's sometimes really difficult to actually get to those people at places like Chelsea, because you have to fight your way to the front to get to the stand to get the leaflet, which then explains about the garden. it's really hard. You can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. It'd be like taking someone to an art gallery and saying, do you get this piece of art? And unless you maybe have certain level of knowledge of art, you might go, no, it just looks like some red squares on a thing that my 2-year-old could have done. It's really tough. And so I don't know if all of the gardens necessarily work. I suppose putting it on the telly is good because then people can find out more about the story behind the garden, how it was built, the message behind it. But yes, there isn't a key to it. There isn't a secret. I would say the best way is to get the leaflet or try and grab someone who's on the stand and they'll actually explain it to you.
Oh, I'm glad to know it's not just me that's not understanding some of the show gardens then. And it seems that really the crux of it is that, particularly with the conceptual gardens, it's perhaps the garden itself is asking a question and starting a conversation rather than giving an answer, potentially. So the TV coverage of the likes of the Chelsea Flower Show and indeed when we visit any flower show always gives the impression that the show gardens effortlessly appeared from nowhere, dropped from the sky, and it was suddenly there, a beautiful show garden. But I always get the distinct impression that that's very much showmanship, for want of a better word. So perhaps you could give us an insider's view of the process behind the glossy end results that we all get to enjoy when we see the TV coverage or when we visit a flower show.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of people who go to the show and make it happen. And I don't think any one of them would have an easy ride. Everybody that is behind the scenes at that show is working really hard. I took some veterans up through the charity that I work for to see the thing being built. We put together a trade stand and they were gobsmacked. It's like a building site. It's just like the most manic building site you've ever seen. There's things reversing, there's frayed nerves, there's shouting, there's swearing, there's crying, there's a lot of blood, sweat and tears literally goes into these gardens. Everybody's frazzled, everybody's knackered. It is only the payoff of having this kind of glamorous show week afterwards, which actually isn't that glamorous if you're working on stand because you are dealing with public day in, day out, all day. People travelling from miles away to build these gardens. They're away from their families a lot of the time. They're staying in rented accommodation, which can be, can be good or can be bad. Some of them, even like the guys that I took, hadn't really been to London. They hadn't driven in London, and it's really a very stressful environment for a lot of people. So yeah, that there is a total disconnect between what happens on the Monday morning. If you went to the showground on Saturday, it's still a complete building site. There's just rubbish everywhere. There's people trying to sweep. There's people trying to frantically finish planting. And, it really is. I don't know how it comes together, but it does. So yeah, it is nothing like, I wish people could see actually what goes on behind the scenes, because it is, yeah, it's a mammoth undertaking, which is another reason why I kind of was questioning the relevance of the show in this day and age, because there is such a lot of work, a lot of waste, a lot of energy goes into it. Yeah.
And a great deal of expense as well, which then leads me on to who actually pays for these gardens to be produced.
Yeah, another very good question. And another thing that I was kind of playing with in my mind. I think over the years, it's become more difficult for gardens to be built because a lot of gardens historically, well, not historically, but, relatively recently were built by charities in order to kind of promote the charity for marketing purposes. And then some charities have actually pulled out of the show because they got a backlash from their donors, because the donors quite rightly said, we don't donate to this charity so that you can build this show garden and have a lovely gala evening for some, executives. We give you money to actually go to the end recipients. So that, I think, is more tricky at the moment. And so interestingly, this year, there is a organisation, which is a charity called Project Giving Back. And so there's 39 gardens at the show this year. Project Giving Back actually paid for 12 of them. Project Giving Back was set up very recently by two anonymous individuals. And they, as I say, have funded a quarter of the gardens at the show. So that's kind of, I think, changed the face of it somewhat, because now we've got a charity who are paying another charity to build gardens for charities. It's very weird. I don't know if it's sustainable. I don't know if it's the right way forward. These gardens are huge amounts of money, and who in this day and age, especially if we look like we're tipping over into some really tough financial times, who's going to be able to justify building these gardens? It's a tricky question. And again, it kind of begs the question about the sustainability of the future of the show. And a lot of people do actually say, oh, well, the RHS won't stop doing these shows because they make them so much money. But because I knew I was talking to you, I went onto the RHS Charity Commission annual report, and I looked at the financial section. And it seems that actually the shows all just about wash their face. I think they come out with about 700,000 profit, the RHS, from the shows. And that is on a figure of, so I think the total income from the shows was 22.9 million. And the total expenditure on the shows was 22.2. I might have got that slightly wrong. But basically, they're not really making a lot of money on these shows when you consider the effort that's gone in. So unless they're managing to drive membership astronomically as a result of these shows, they're not these money-making enterprises that everybody assumes that they are. But I did notice, the floral marquee seemed to be less nurseries this year than previous years. Again, I guess that's pandemic-related to a degree. But a lot of people, that it's expensive to have kind of stands and things at these shows. Yeah, it comes about in various ways, but I think it's getting much more difficult to do that. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes in the future.
Very interesting. And it's interesting to hear that the RHS shows really don't make them a huge amount of money. But obviously they're the headline events that everybody knows the RHS for, really. And you mentioned in terms of sponsors for gardens, I wondered how a designer goes about coming up with a compelling brief that fits both with what the sponsor wants and also with your own ethos, and leading on from that, whether you can actually do justice to a brief that doesn't really sit with your own ethos, or whether that would be something that just wouldn't work and a designer perhaps would respectfully decline that work, maybe.
I'm sure there are designers who would say, actually, I can't work with that. I'm sure there's designers who just want a show garden and want that under their belt and therefore are prepared to compromise. I guess there's some and some, definitely. In terms of writing a brief, if you are good at writing and English, then you can put together a brief that's really vague and difficult to judge. So that is definitely a thing. Yeah, don't back yourself into a corner in your brief if you're ever doing a show garden.
No, say very little with lots of words, essentially, as the guidance for drafting your brief.
Exactly that. Yeah.
And there does seem to me to be a tendency with a lot of, particularly the Chelsea gardens over the years, towards more wild gardens. One of my own personal favourites from recent years was the high maintenance garden for the Motor Neurone Disease Association, which was at the last pre-COVID Chelsea Flower Show back in 2019. And I wondered why you think there's such a trend towards the wild garden style, if style's the right word for it.
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is. This year, actually, not so much as the show before, I think. It did get toned down a little bit this year. And it was really interesting because you had two polar opposite gardens. And one was the one that was done for Rewilding Britain. And that was a recreation, basically, of a kind of beaver habitat. And I think that won Best in Show. Some people would have loved it. Other people, so I went with somebody who's an amateur gardener but very much interested in gardens, and she said, I'm not inspired by it. Basically, it's just a chunk of woodland or just a chunk of wild habitat plonked in the Chelsea Flower Show, and it's clever that you can reproduce that, but is it a garden? Is it art? I don't know. Or is it just pastiche? I don't know. And so, I'm sure lots of people would have looked at that, especially if they're from maybe an urban habitat and that's not their immediate landscape, they may have found it really intriguing. I don't know whether they would have sold it as a garden or whether it was even intended to be a garden. You know, it was more of a habitat. So that comes back to the question is, what is a garden as per the RHS criteria? You know, who knows? But then you had a completely different garden, which was my favourite garden at the show, which was Kate Gould's garden. Which was called Out of the Shadows. She had a lot of exotic planting. It was Kate is, I think, one of the best designers in this country. She is fantastic. And this garden just was beautiful. And everything she does is meticulous and clever. And she put a spa in there. And it was basically a garden that was meant to work for lots of different purposes. So it had the spa, it had a resistance kind of pool, gym bars, various other bits and pieces. So it was a tiny garden, but multifunctional. And she, as I said, used a lot of exotic planting. So she just went actually like, go for it, go big or go home. I'm going to put this in. This is clearly an ornamental garden. It's, very much non-natives. It doesn't look like anything you'd find in the wild. So it was really interesting to see those two gardens, against each other. And you kind of think, well, should a garden be that? It's all well and good rewilding and having, natural looking gardens. But, is that a garden? I don't know. It's a very big question. It's a big debate. And is that the sort of garden people want to see if they go to flower shows? Or do they just look at one wild garden and then they see another one and then they see another one and they kind of going, oh, okay, well, that's lovely, but it's just a piece of nature as opposed to a garden. Again, as I said, I have no answers. All I can say is that it's not a new trend because I interviewed Mary Reynolds and she did her garden back in 2002 and that was a very wild garden. And then since then, we've seen the kind of trend emerging. It's tough to say, isn't it? Is it a reflection of how people are gardening, or is it the RHS trying to favour those kind of gardens so that we consider wildlife more, that we consider native planting more, that we, go down the naturalistic route? I don't know. So yeah, interesting to see, and interesting to see how that trend develops, I think.
Yes, and I think it's that interesting juxtaposition really between the sort of very tropical non-native planting that people would probably see more as a garden in inverted commas than native sort of recreations or whatever we want to call them, of a natural habitat that people perhaps don't see quite through the same lens of what they think is a garden. But it's an interesting point, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think people would assume that I would say, oh, actually, I like the wild gardens, and I do, but I think that gardens have to be, and I always say this, I think gardens have to be unapologetically gardens, but we have to do it on a smaller scale. So if you've got a garden that's maybe 1/4 of an acre, you have 1/8 of an acre, and that's your ornamental bit, or the area around your house is the ornamental bit, then you have to leave the other bits to kind of get on with it and have somewhere for nature. And I would say even if you've got a tiny garden, you can still do that. You can still not interfere in spaces. So there's bits for humans, and then there's bits for all the rest of, nature to flourish.
Mm. And that sort of leads me on really to one of the topics that I think is going to be a really important topic going forward, and probably is an important topic currently as well, that the sustainability of show gardens. As far as I can see, there does seem to be perhaps a slow but progressive shift towards more of the show gardens at the likes of Chelsea having a second life after the show's over. I know that there was some change, I think, for this year in terms of the judging criteria to explore what was happening with the gardens after, and that may become a part of the judging criteria from 2023, if I'm understanding that rightly. But I wondered if there's more that can be done to improve sustainability. I know that the RHS this year had banned plastic grass, which I, for one, was very pleased about. But is there more that can be done to make show gardens and to make these flower shows more sustainable, do you think?
I mean, how can you sustainably build that circus? You can't. I just think that I had an idea, which was, let's have a flower show, which is virtual. Then the gardens get built in situ where they're going to end up living anyway. And then you can kind of tour them virtually. There must be some way with the technology that we've got that we could do something like that. Or they hold it less frequently. Do they need a Chelsea flower show every single year? Probably not. Can we do it once every 2 years, 5 years? Maybe that would make it more sustainable. We were at the show, and the people that I work with were just going skip diving and going, oh my God, that person's going to put that wood in the skip. Look at think about the price of wood. So we were literally going getting stuff out of the skip. I'm not sure I meant to say that, because I think people go around and take stuff out the skip, and some of it does get reused and repurposed, but I'm sure a lot of it ends up in the bin. These were offcuts of ply that are going to get used to make bird boxes and things where we are. But, how can you make that sustainable? You cannot possibly. It is just a mammoth thing. It's just in terms of getting the structures put up that the RHS use. The traffic in London, the weight of traffic that we must add to on the streets, the amount of people that come to the show, the catering, like I say, the rubbish disposal, all those materials. Yeah, they do get relocated, a lot of the gardens. I mean, how many gardens do you ever hear about, though, where someone goes, oh, this is an ex-Chelsea garden, doesn't it look lovely? The only one I can think of is Tom Stewart Smith, who's repurposed a lot of his stuff into his own private home. Otherwise, they're not there, are they? You don't go, oh, look at this wonderful Chelsea garden, and then it becomes a famous garden in its second incarnation. So I don't know. I don't know if they can be sustainable. Maybe we just, part of me just thinks we don't need it.
Well, I think ultimately something that's built just to last a week, but built at great cost monetarily and in terms of the labour that goes into it and the materials, probably is inherently not sustainable by its very nature. But that leads me on to another question of perhaps whether, although the actual building of the garden itself and the whole spectacle of the show is not sustainable, whether perhaps it's an opportunity to encourage people and inspire people to be more sustainable in their own gardening practices and in their own gardens that they've got at home.
You would like to think that the RHS, as a massive charity, that would be their primary aim. They're not there. They do not exist to make money. They have got the perfect opportunity, even if it means they just need to downsize a bit or they need to scrap the shows or whatever. They have got not just an opportunity, an obligation to promote sustainable gardening, and they are not doing it with the shows. They're just pandering to people. They're scared to make changes. They're scared to say, actually, this is not the way we should be moving forward. They just keep on keeping on because that's what they've always done. And, there would probably be a backlash if they scrap the shows. But they, if they can't be brave and lead by example, then really who can? It doesn't sit that well, and as you sort of mentioned when you emailed me about the shows, is there a degree of elitism? Yeah, there is with these shows. Who can afford the price of a Chelsea ticket? Who actually goes and buys stuff at these shows, on some of the trade stands and things? The price of those greenhouses that they have there, I mean, it's just out of this world. Is it the best use of the RHS's time and money? I don't know. I think they probably need to be doing other things, really.
And I think the concern is that in some ways the RHS is publicly saying things like, we must stop using peat, which we absolutely must. But then how many of the plants raised for the gardens that were built there and the plants sold on stands, and that's by the excellent nurseries, but how many of those are still raised in composts that contain peat, and how many are raised using quite nasty pesticides? I suspect it's almost inevitable that systemic pesticides would have to be used to actually make sure that you've got X volume of plants all in the same stage of growth and the same condition and pest-free by a particular date. It's almost inevitable that you would have to not be raising them organically and environmentally sustainably.
Yeah, and also you need them to arrive at the showground not looking chewed or, rough around the edges. They need to look perfect. But it was really interesting. Cleve West helped assist on the planting. I think he advised on the planting on one of the gardens, and he said as they were prepping the garden, they found I think it was a caterpillar on one of the hedging plants, and they had a debate as a team whether to leave it or whether to get rid of it, and they knew it would probably affect their mark if they left it, but they took the decision to leave it. And it's really interesting when people are building the gardens at Chelsea, the thing that's guaranteed to get everyone excited is when they get the plants off the truck and the bees turn up and they start going visiting the flowers, and everybody goes, oh, look, the bees have arrived, love it, absolutely love it. But that's no good, as we know through people like Dave Goulson, that's no good if that plant is drenched in something horrendous that's going to damage the bees. So yeah, again, is it sustainable from that angle? Quite probably not, because you can't achieve perfection, and that's what they require on these stands and these gardens. So yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I did planting on a garden. I can say that my plants were peat free and UK grown, for whatever that means. And can I guarantee there were no pesticides on my plants? No, I can't. And so I'm as guilty as the next person. Yeah, it's very, very tricky. But it's not sustainable, is it? There's no way we can carry on doing this.
No, perhaps it's time for the RHS criterion on judging to include environmental sustainability, although that then goes back to your point that the RHS are currently, at least, very slow to actually adapt to the changing world, and that will, if they don't adapt, will ultimately be their downfall. That the demand for environmentally sustainable practices and wildlife friendly practices and gardening in line with climate change and things like that is going to be more and more prevalent as the years go on. And really, I guess the time has come for the shows and for the RHS as a charity to perhaps follow that. And that again leads me on to, we've already sort of discussed it to an extent, and you've touched on it in a couple of answers really, but it leads me on to the relevance of show gardens. And I mean, so many of us would either visit a show or watch coverage of a show and think, okay, that particular, those couple of plants there, that's a really lovely combination. That would work in that corner of the garden. That would work in that bed, that border. But can we take any other inspiration or anything else home from these shows to actually be relevant to our own garden spaces?
I mean, yeah, of course. Again, I went with somebody who does garden and was so excited to be there and looked round and took photos and said, I'm getting loads of inspiration. And, that will encourage that person to explore things in their garden, and they might not do it. They might do it in an environmentally friendly way. They might do it in a wildlife friendly way. So that's great. But as we've kind of already said, the perfection of a show garden and wildlife gardening, the two things are diametrically opposed. You can't have both. You can't support and promote both at the same time. It's really, it's almost impossible. Even the Rewild in Britain garden, that was, sorry, my dogs are barking now. They had lots of stuff that was indigenous to the British Isles in terms of plants, but are they going to be chewed? Because those plants are a food source for a lot of insects. So were they chewed? No, they weren't. And should they be in the natural state? Yeah, they probably should. So yeah, I don't know. Yes, you can get lots of inspiration from the show, and I'm not knocking it on that level, but it doesn't really work on lots of other levels.
Absolutely, and I think if anybody can be inspired to find a love of gardening, then that's that's great. I'm all for that. I think for me, it's perhaps more the concern in terms of how these events are portrayed in the media, with all of the glitz and glamour and the celebrity days and things that perhaps for some would seem very alien to them and seem like something that would be really quite off-putting. So perhaps it's more, perhaps it's less about the shows itself and more about how they're portrayed in the media and how they're presented by the TV coverage and the wider media. And that sort of led me on. You mentioned in terms of planting on some of the gardens, and as far as I understand, the majority of show garden planting is actually done by volunteers, and quite a lot of them, from articles I've seen, quite a lot of the volunteers are women. And obviously the issue of unpaid labour is divisive in so many professions, with some arguments on one hand that it's an abuse of those that are desperate to get into the industry, with people on the other side arguing that actually it gives people excellent work experience that they can then take forward into that career or even into something totally different. And I wondered, from your position as an industry professional, do you think that it represents an issue of diversity and inclusion, the voluntary labour, that is, or is it just a good opportunity for people to be part of that show garden spectacle, or perhaps it's more nuanced than either of those extremes?
Yeah, I think it is. It's some and some, isn't it? There will be designers who come out of that show making no money. It's not just the people who are planting on stands. I mean, yes, they get exploited quite often. They don't get even expenses, some of them, to get up there. They're just expected to turn up and go, and enjoy the privilege of working from like 8 a.m. till 7 p.m, absolutely flat out. It's probably a different experience depending on which garden you work on. But it is a fact these gardens would not be built if it wasn't for sheer love. I mean, for example, the balcony gardens last year at Chelsea, the RHS, I think I'm right in saying, gave the designers about £6,000. It might have been 6, might have been 10. I'd have to double check that, but it wasn't any more than that. And said to them, right, you go and build a balcony garden. And then, of course, the designer knows that to get a good looking garden, they're not going to be able to do it for that money. So yeah, you mentioned about limiting the budget for gardens. And then the RHS will say, well, you need to go now and find beg, steal or borrow some plants and some furniture and some this, that and the other. And again, you're going to companies and you're saying, can I have some plants free in exchange for me saying that they've gone to RHS Chelsea, and ditto furniture, ditto sculpture. You might say to a sculptor, oh, okay, right, I'll put your sculpture in my garden, if then you can sell it at the show, someone will buy it. But this cost has to be borne by somebody, and it's quite often the people who can least afford it, that get tapped up for loads of freebies, and nobody should be doing anything for free. We just shouldn't. I don't care what what organisation you work for. You should not be expected to subsidise a larger organisation through your goodwill and generosity. And, they should reward people for a job well done and, time spent working for them. So yes, again, if you took into account the true cost of everything at those shows, they would not get built if it wasn't for love and goodwill at all. But I don't think it's always the people at the kind of, lower end of the spectrum who are getting completely shafted. I think quite often a lot of people come out of it, you do it for the prestige, do it for the name and the advertising, but actually come out of it many times out of pocket.
It's a really tricky question, a really tricky issue. I think it's difficult as to how you actually resolve that situation without then making it even more irrelevant to some, because of the sums of money that are being thrown at it. So it almost becomes a cyclical argument, I suppose. One of my last couple of questions, who are the unsung heroes of the show garden world? we obviously hear about the designers and the sponsors, but who would you say are the unsung heroes of the show garden world?
Anybody who is not getting paid, anybody who's donating stuff for free, anybody who is probably, although I do want to curse them when I'm there, probably anyone who's involved in any sort of traffic management at the showgrounds wants a medal of their own. Yeah, I think anyone who does the cleaning up behind the scenes wants a medal. If you've been in those toilets during the build-up week, then anybody that is cleaning those up is an unsung hero in my book. Anybody who's dealing with queues and queues around the block of people wanting coffee. Yeah, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people who work really, really hard to make those shows happen and don't necessarily get the accolades they deserve.
Absolutely. And last but by no means least, and possibly the trickiest question perhaps, but what next for show gardens? Where do you see things going in the future?
Yeah, that's really tricky, isn't it? And I think we've kind of touched on that. I think they'll have to come back to being gardens rather than these wildlife kind of nods to wild landscapes, because I just think that's not going to wash with people. And as I said, maybe they will just happen with less regularity, because I think there are rumblings, people do ask questions. And if I could avoid it, I wouldn't go to every single Chelsea Flower Show, because they're bloody boring. If you've seen them, you've seen one, you've seen them all. Like I said, there's a lot of very samey things, and you can get really jaded, and you can walk around, and Hampton Court's same, and you walk around and you'll go, oh, okay, right, this again. Have we got this again? We've got some roses and some lupins, lovely. You don't need to visit. The trade stands are exactly the same. Anyone who's walked down Main Avenue at Chelsea or around the corner will have seen that the stand with the big horse sculpture. There's the same things appearing year after year after year. There's very little in the way of novel things, so we don't need to be doing it all the time, do we? I really fail to see the novelty that warrants it happening year in, year out.
Absolutely. We need new, but sustainable, inclusive, and relevant and relatable to the real world as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let's make it more kind of local. Let's have less massive events and more, maybe more frequent, but more local and small scale things that people can enjoy. I mean, I think that's probably the solution to lots of things, not just horticulture related. I'd like to thank Dave immensely for taking the time out of what I know is his very busy schedule, for putting together such thoughtful questions, and for having the most impressive collection of houseplants I've yet to notice on a Zoom call. And let's be honest, we all know we're secretly competitive houseplant peacocking when we're in online meetings. A few disclaimers: don't rely on my research, especially when I'm quoting numbers, which I'm notoriously bad with. If the topic of show gardens interests you, please do your own research into it. And this interview is based on my experience. It's my take on the shows. Other opinions are available. I also forgot to shout out to the landscape construction people when I spoke about unsung heroes. They put the entire thing together nuts and bolts and often don't get mentioned at all. So a very big thanks to you for listening as well. Normal service will resume next week.